Ilara sat at her glass desk, but she wasn't really there. Outside her office window, the city was a masterpiece of her own creation. Towering buildings, sharp against the gray sky, stood like monuments to her ambition. She had designed the sleek silver tower across the street. People called it a marvel. But today, for Ilara, it just felt like a cage. Her hands were resting on a set of blueprints, but the lines and numbers were just a blur. A high-pitched ringing, a sound only she could hear, was screaming inside her head. It had started as a faint buzz a year ago, an annoying little companion to her stress. Now it was a constant, piercing siren that never, ever stopped. She tried to focus on the blueprint. It was for a new public library, a project that should have excited her. But all she could think about was the last one, the Riverstone Art Gallery. It had been her passion project, a flowing, beautiful design that everyone had loved on paper. But a flaw in the supplied materials, a mistake she should have caught, caused a section of the roof to sag. It didn't collapse, no one was hurt, but the headlines were brutal. Architect's dream becomes a structural nightmare. Ilara's flaw, that was 6 months ago. The professional failure was bad enough, but it had also been the final heavy stone that sank her relationship with Mark. "I can't live with a ghost, Ilara," he had said, his voice tired. "You're here, but you're never here. It's always the next project, the next problem. I need someone who is present." And just like that, her two anchors, her work and her relationship, were gone. Now there was only the ringing. A soft knock came at her door. Her assistant, Ben, peeked in, his face full of the gentle concern she had come to dread. "Ilara, your 4 o'clock is here." "The developers for the waterfront project?" Ilara looked at him, and for a terrifying second she couldn't find the words. Her mind was a blank white screen. The ringing swelled. "Ilara?" Ben's voice was closer now, laced with worry. She blinked, forcing herself back into her body. "Yes, sorry, send them in." As the developers, 2 men in sharp suits, walked in, full of energy and handshakes, Ilara put on her mask. It was a mask she had perfected, confident, sharp, in control. She smiled, she nodded, she talked about load-bearing walls and aesthetic flow, but the entire time the ringing was there, a private soundtrack to her public performance. Halfway through the meeting, one of the men, a Mr. Evans, leaned forward. "We were so impressed with your initial concept, Ilara. It has that bold, visionary quality. Just like your work on the North Tower. The North Tower. Her greatest success. It felt like a lifetime ago." "And of course," the other man added with a chuckle, "we know you're a fighter. Anyone who can bounce back from a situation like that Riverstone business has our absolute confidence." Bounce back. The words hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't bounced. She had broken. She was still broken, held together by caffeine, willpower, and this screaming silence in her ears. Her smile felt like it was cracking her face. "Thank you," she heard herself say, her voice strangely distant. The Riverstone project was a learning experience. The meeting dragged on for another 20 minutes. She somehow made it through, her body on autopilot. When they finally left, promising contracts and future meetings, Ilara stayed seated, her hands clenched into fists on the blueprints. The ringing was louder now, a drill boring into her skull. She felt a tightness in her chest, a feeling like she couldn't pull in enough air. The walls of her beautiful, expensive office seemed to be creeping inward. Ben came back in. They loved it. "You were amazing as always."
"Do you want me to get you a coffee before you start on the revisions?"
Ilara didn't answer. She stood up abruptly, her chair rolling back and hitting the window with a soft thud. "Ilara, I need some air," she whispered. She walked out of her office, past the confused looks of her staff, and into the elevator. The descent felt like falling. In the polished brass doors, she saw her reflection, a successful, powerful woman in a tailored suit with eyes full of pure panic. She burst out onto the busy sidewalk. The city erupted around her. Honking cars, snippets of conversations, the rumble of a subway deep below. It was a tidal wave of noise, but it was nothing compared to the noise inside her head. It was all just fuel for the ringing. She found herself walking, not knowing or caring where she was going. Her feet carried her until she stood in a small, pathetic patch of a city park. A few benches, some struggling trees, and a patch of brown grass. She sat on a bench, her head in her hands. She tried to take deep breaths, but they came in ragged gasps. This was more than stress. This was a system shutting down. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her doctor, just 3 days ago, looking at her over his glasses. He had run every test. "There's nothing physically wrong with your ears, Alara," he'd said gently. "The tinnitus is a symptom. Your body's alarm bell. You're suffering from severe burnout. Your nervous system is begging for a rest." "Burnout," she had scoffed. "It's just a fancy word for being tired." "It's not," the doctor said firmly. "It's not just fatigue. It's emotional exhaustion. It's cynicism. It's a feeling of reduced accomplishment. Your body and mind are on strike. And if you don't listen, the consequences will get much, much worse. Burnout is not a badge of honor, Ilara." Sitting on that park bench, surrounded by the indifferent city, his words finally landed. They weren't just words anymore. They were the truth. She was empty. There was nothing left in the tank. The visionary architect, the woman who built skyscrapers, had run out of foundation. She pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over her work email, over Ben's number. She needed to cancel her afternoon, reschedule, do something, but she didn't. Instead, her fingers, moving almost on their own, opened a new browser tab. She typed 2 words into the search bar: silent places. She scrolled through images of dense forests, frozen lakes, and vast, open deserts. And then she saw it. A photograph of a canyon in Utah. It wasn't green or lush. It was a stark, beautiful landscape of red rock, carved by wind and water over millions of years. The caption read, "A place where you can hear yourself think. A place where you can hear yourself think." The idea was so foreign, so desperately beautiful, it made her chest ache. What would it be like to not hear the ringing? What would it be like to hear nothing? Her heart was pounding, but for the first time that day it wasn't from anxiety. It was from a tiny, fragile spark of hope, right there, on the park bench with the city roaring around her. Ilara booked a one-way ticket to Utah. She found a small, rustic cabin for rent on the edge of the desert, owned by someone who didn't ask for references or a business plan. She didn't think about deadlines or clients or failed projects. She didn't think about Mark. She only thought about the silence. She stood up from the bench. The ringing was still there, but it felt different now. It was no longer a siren of despair, but a countdown to her escape. She walked back to her office, not with dread, but with a new, single-minded purpose. She was going to find that quiet, even if she had to walk into the heart of the desert to do it. Her journey was beginning. First, the city's sharp edges blurred outside the airplane window, swallowed by a blanket of clouds. Then the landscape below changed from a messy grid of streets and buildings to a patchwork of brown and green farms. Finally, as the plane began its descent, the earth cracked open, revealing canyons and mesas the color of rust and dried blood. Ilara pressed her forehead against the cool plastic window, her breath catching. It looked like another planet. The airport was small, just a single low building. The air when she stepped out of the terminal was the first shock. It wasn't the heavy, humid air of the city, thick with exhaust and the smell of 1,000 lunches. This air was thin, dry, and carried a faint, clean scent of dust and juniper. She took a deep breath, and it felt like her lungs were expanding for the first time in years. Her rental car was a simple, dusty SUV. She plugged the address of the cabin into her phone. The digital map showed a thin, winding line leading away from the main road, and then nothing. The destination was a blank spot. The drive out of the small town was quick. The paved road gave way to gravel. The crunch of the tires a loud, rhythmic sound. Then the gravel road became a dirt track, little more than 2 dusty ruts carved into the hard red earth. The SUV bounced and jolted, and Ilara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She passed a lone, weathered wooden sign that read simply, Echo Canyon. After what felt like an hour of slow, careful driving, she saw it. A small, simple log cabin nestled against a wall of red rock. It looked ancient and sturdy, as if it had grown straight out of the desert. This was it. She turned off the engine. The click of the key was startlingly loud, and then nothing. No, not nothing. This was the second shock. The silence. In the city, silence was a rare and relative thing. It was the space between sirens, the quiet hum of a refrigerator at night, the distant thrum of traffic that was always there, a constant bass note to your life. This was different. This silence had weight. It was a physical presence. It pressed against her ears. She sat in the car for a full 5 minutes just listening. There was no wind, no birds, no distant cars, just a vast empty quiet. Slowly, she opened the car door. The squeak of the hinge was an offense, a scream in a sacred library. She winced and stepped out, her boots making a soft crunch on the gravel. The sound seemed to travel for miles before being swallowed by the immense stillness. She walked towards the cabin, each footstep a thunderclap in the void. Her own breathing sounded ragged and far too loud. She could hear the rustle of her jacket, the faint creak of her own joints. It was unnerving. She was making too much noise, disturbing the peace of this ancient place. She found the key under a painted rock as the owner had promised, and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The cabin inside was dark and cool, smelling of pine logs and old dust. It had one main room with a small kitchenette, a wooden table, and a worn sofa facing a stone fireplace. A single door led to a small bedroom. It was simple. It was perfect. She dropped her bags by the door and walked back outside, drawn by the strange pull of the quiet. She walked a short distance from the cabin, towards the mouth of the canyon. The rock walls rose on either side, towering and majestic, streaked with layers of red, orange, and white. She found a flat, sun-warmed boulder and sat down, hugging her knees to her chest, and she waited. She waited for her mind to relax. She waited for the tight knot in her chest to loosen. She waited for the ringing in her ears to finally, blessedly stop. But it didn't. Instead, something else happened. The external silence, the one outside her head, began to fade into the background. It was like her ears were adjusting, tuning into a new, subtler frequency. She heard a faint whish, the sound of her own blood pumping through her veins. She heard a tiny, high-pitched buzz, maybe a flying insect far away. A small rock dislodged by some unseen lizard clattered down the canyon wall, the sound echoing for a surprising amount of time. And underneath it all, the ringing in her ears persisted. It was still there, that high-pitched scream, but now, with no city noise to fight against, it was the loudest thing in her universe. It wasn't a part of the background anymore. It was the main event. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. She had come all this way to escape the noise, and she had brought the worst of it with her, right inside her own head. This wasn't peace. This was a trap. In the city, the noise outside could sometimes drown out the noise inside. Here there was nothing to hide behind. The internal scream had center stage. What have I done? The thought was clear and terrifying. I've stranded myself in the middle of nowhere, and I'm still broken. She thought of her office, of Ben's concerned face, of the developers in their sharp suits. Even that world, the one that was making her sick, felt safer and more familiar than this overwhelming, judgmental silence. She felt a sudden, desperate urge to get back in the car, drive to the airport and take the first flight home, to go back to the devil she knew. But as she stood up, ready to flee, a gentle breeze stirred. It swept down the canyon, rustling the dry leaves of a nearby bush. It was a soft sighing sound, like a long, slow breath. It carried the scent of sun-baked stone and sage. The breeze brushed against her face, and for a single, fleeting second, the ringing in her ears seemed to dip, just a little. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't as sharp. It was just a moment. Then it was back. But that moment was enough. Ilara sat back down. Her heart was still pounding, but the panic had receded, replaced by a grim determination. She hadn't expected a miracle. She hadn't expected the silence to magically cure her. She had come here to listen, and now she was starting to understand. The first thing she had to listen to was herself, to all the noise she had been running from. The sun was beginning to set, painting the canyon walls in fiery shades of orange and deep purple. The shadows grew long and the air grew cool. Ilara wrapped her arms around herself and watched the light change. She didn't move. She just sat there in the heart of the immense quiet and listened to the sound of her own breaking. It was loud and it was painful, but for the first time she wasn't trying to outrun it. She was just hearing it. Her journey hadn't ended with her arrival. It had only just truly begun. The first night in the cabin was a long, cold battle with the silence. Ilara had built a fire in the stone fireplace, the crackle and pop of the logs a welcome, familiar sound. But when the fire died down to embers, the quiet rushed back in, heavier than before. Every tiny noise, the settling of the old logs in the cabin, the scuttle of what she hoped was just a mouse in the roof, made her jump. She lay in the narrow bed staring at the dark ceiling, the ringing in her ears her only companion. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. When the gray light of dawn finally filtered through the small window, She felt more tired than when she had gone to bed. Her body ached with a deep exhaustion that coffee couldn't fix. She made a cup, sipping the bitter liquid as she looked out at the canyon, now washed in soft morning light. It was beautiful, but it felt like a painting behind glass, something to look at but not something she could touch or be a part of. She needed a plan, a task. Her city mind, the one that was always chasing the next item on a to-do list, kicked in. Supplies, it told her. You need food, water, a proper map. The small town she had driven through to get here was the only place for miles. She got back into the SUV, the engine roaring to life, feeling like a violation. She drove the dusty track back to the main road, the crunch of gravel under her tires a familiar, almost comforting rhythm. The town wasn't much more than a single street. A general store, a post office the size of a shed, and a gas station with 2 old pumps. She parked and walked into the general store. A little bell jingled above the door. The store was a wonderful, cluttered mess. It smelled of old wood, leather, and coffee. Cans of food were stacked on wooden shelves. Fishing tackle hung from a rack, and a glass counter displayed knives and local rocks. An older man stood behind the counter, polishing a piece of turquoise with a soft cloth. He had a kind, weathered face, a thick gray beard, and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, quiet calm. He wore a simple ranger's shirt. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, like stones tumbling in a river. "Good morning," Ilara replied, her own voice sounding too sharp and high-pitched in the quiet store. She moved through the aisles, picking up some canned soup, pasta, and a few bottles of water. Her movements felt rushed and clumsy. She was aware of the man's calm presence, and it made her feel even more out of place. She was a frantic bird that had flown into a still, quiet room. She brought her items to the counter. The man, whose name tag read Leo, rang them up slowly and carefully on an old manual cash register. "Passing through?" he asked, not looking up from the keys. "Staying for a bit," Ilara said. "At the cabin near Echo Canyon." Leo nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement. "Good spot." He looked up, and his eyes, a pale, clear blue, seemed to see right through her. They didn't judge. They just observed. "First time out here?" "Yes," Ilara said, feeling a need to explain herself. "I just needed some quiet." A small, knowing smile touched Leo's lips. "Quiet's what we have," he said. He finished bagging her groceries and handed them to her. "The quiet out here, it takes some folks by surprise. It's not empty. It's full. You just have to learn how to listen." Ilara felt a flicker of irritation. She was tired of people speaking in riddles. "I just need the noise in my head to stop," she said, more bluntly than she intended. Leo didn't seem offended. He leaned on the counter, his large, work-roughened hands resting on the worn wood. "I was a geologist for 40 years, he said. "Studied these rocks. Most people think the canyon is just there, a thing, but it's not. It's a story." He pointed a finger out the window towards the distant red cliffs. "See those layers? Each one is a chapter. That deep red at the bottom? That's the oldest. A time of vast deserts millions of years ago. The white stripe above it? That was an ancient sea. The darker cap on top? That's harder rock from a different time altogether." Ilara found herself really looking at the canyon walls. She had seen them as a single massive shape. Now she began to see the lines, the different colors, the history. "The wind and the water," Leo continued, his voice soft and steady. "They don't read the story. They don't care about the chapters. They just flow. Slowly, patiently, they carve their way through. They reveal the story layer by layer." He looked back at her, his gaze steady. "The canyon isn't just rock. It's time, and it has its own rhythm, a slow one. Listen to it and you might just find your own." He said it so simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Listen to the rhythm of time. For a moment, standing in that cluttered store, Ilara felt the tight knot in her chest loosen, just a little. This wasn't a doctor giving her a clinical diagnosis. This wasn't a friend offering empty sympathy. This was a man who understood the land, offering a different kind of prescription. She paid for her groceries and picked up the bag. "Try the narrow canyon to the east of your cabin," Leo said as she turned to leave. "The one that looks like a crack in the wall. The walls are close there. It holds the quiet differently. Might be a good place to start listening." "Thank you," Ilara said, and this time her voice was softer. Back in the car, she didn't immediately start the engine. She sat for a moment, looking at the bag of groceries on the passenger seat. A can of soup, some pasta, a few bottles of water, simple things, and a simple piece of advice from a man who seemed to understand the desert's soul. He hadn't told her to meditate or to try a special breathing technique. He had just told her to listen to the rocks, to find a rhythm. She drove back to the cabin, but the feeling was different. The desert didn't feel like a hostile, empty place anymore. It felt like a library, a vast open-air library filled with ancient books, and Leo had just given her her first reading card. She didn't know how to read the books yet, but for the first time she felt a small spark of curiosity instead of pure fear. She had come here to escape her noise, but maybe, just maybe, the answer wasn't about running from something, but about tuning into something else, something older, slower, and infinitely more patient. Her first guide had appeared not as a guru on a mountain, but as a quiet geologist in a general store. And his first lesson was simple. The story was already written in the stone. She just had to learn how to read it. The morning sun was warm on Alara's back as she stood at the mouth of the narrow canyon. Leo was right. It didn't look like an entrance. It looked like a crack. A deep, thin slice the desert had taken out of the massive red wall. It was so narrow she wondered if she could even fit through. She had her small backpack with a bottle of water, a protein bar, and a nervous energy that made her fingers tingle. This was it, her first real task. Not a business meeting, not a deadline, but a walk. A simple, quiet walk into a crack in the earth. She took a deep breath and stepped into the shadow of the canyon. The change was immediate and shocking. The wide open world vanished. The sky became a thin, bright blue ribbon far above her head. The air, which had been moving freely on the desert floor, went still and cool. It was like stepping into a giant natural cathedral. Her first few steps were loud. The gravel under her boots crunched and echoed off the smooth, high walls. The sound seemed to bounce back and forth from one side to the other, before fading into the depths ahead. It felt rude, like talking in a library. She stopped and just stood for a moment, letting the silence settle back down. She could hear her own heartbeat, a steady thump-thump in her chest. The ringing in her ears was still there, a high-pitched background hum, but in this enclosed space it felt different. It was just one sound among others now, not the only sound. She started walking again, but this time she tried to be quieter. She placed her feet carefully, aiming for patches of sand instead of loose rock. The difference was remarkable. Her footsteps became soft shushes instead of loud crunches. She was learning the first rule of this place: move with care. The canyon wasn't just a straight line. It twisted and turned, revealing new secrets around every corner. In some places, the walls were so close she had to turn sideways to slip through. The rock was smooth to the touch, worn down by thousands of years of occasional floodwaters. She ran her fingers over it. It felt cool and ancient. She found a flat, sun-warmed boulder that looked like a perfect chair nestled against one wall. This was far enough for today. She sat down, pulled her knees up to her chest, and just listened. At first, she heard nothing but the ringing. She focused on it as she always did, and felt the familiar frustration begin to rise. It's still here. Nothing has changed, but then she remembered Leo's words. Listen to it, not fight it. Not hate it, just listen. So she tried. She stopped treating the ringing like an enemy and just accepted it as a sound, like the sound of her breath. And as she did, her awareness began to expand. She started to hear other things, tiny sounds she had been drowning out with her own frustration. She heard the faintest whisper of a breeze, so high up it only touched the very top of the canyon walls. She heard the quiet, dry rustle of a single leaf from a stubborn little bush growing out of a crack in the rock. Scritch, scratch. A tiny lizard, no bigger than her finger, scurried over a rock nearby, its movement the softest of sounds. Then a low coo echoed softly from somewhere above. A mourning dove. The sound was lonely and beautiful, and it hung in the quiet air for a long moment before fading away. She was listening, truly listening, and a strange thing began to happen. The ringing in her ears didn't go away, but it seemed to step back. It moved from the front of her mind to the background. It became just one instrument in a very quiet, very delicate orchestra. The orchestra of the canyon. She wasn't trying to empty her mind. In fact, her mind was very busy, but it was busy noticing things. The way the light hit a swirl of white mineral in the red rock. The intricate pattern of a spider's web. glistening with tiny dewdrops in a shaded corner, the sheer, impossible height of the walls reaching for that narrow strip of blue sky. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't thinking about the failed gallery. She wasn't hearing Mark's voice saying, "You're never really here." She wasn't planning her next move or worrying about her inbox. She was just here, on a rock, in a canyon, listening. A feeling washed over her that was so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It wasn't excitement. It was peace, a quiet, simple peace. It was the feeling of a knot, tied tight for years, slowly, gently, beginning to loosen. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. The sunbeam that had been warming her feet slowly climbed up her legs and then disappeared as the sun moved across the sky. When she finally stood up to leave, her body felt stiff, but her mind felt clearer than it had in months. The walk back out of the canyon felt different. Her footsteps were still quiet, but they felt lighter, more sure. She wasn't an intruder anymore. She was a visitor who was learning the rules. As she stepped out of the narrow crack and back into the wide openness of the desert, the world felt brighter, the air easier to breathe. The ringing was still there, waiting for her, but it didn't scream at her anymore. It was just a hum. She looked back at the narrow crack in the wall. From out here, it looked insignificant, just a small line on a massive face of rock, but she knew now that it held an entire world inside, a world of quiet sounds and ancient peace. She hadn't found a cure, but she had found a moment, a single beautiful moment where the noise inside her had grown quiet enough to hear the world outside, and for now that was enough. It was more than enough. It was a beginning. The feeling of peace was a beautiful, fragile bubble, and like all bubbles, it couldn't last forever. For 2 days, Ilara held on to the feeling from the canyon. She woke up with the sun, made her simple coffee, and sat outside the cabin watching the light change on the rocks. She even tried sketching, not buildings, but the shapes of the clouds and the shadows they cast on the mesa. The ringing in her ears was still present, but it felt more distant, like a neighbor's TV playing in another room. On the third morning, she decided to go deeper. She wanted to find the spot Leo had mentioned, the one deep in the canyon where a small seasonal spring sometimes created a pool. She packed her backpack with more water and food, feeling a sense of purpose. This was her new project, find the hidden pool. The first part of the hike was familiar and comforting. The narrow walls, the soft sand under her feet, the quiet. But as she went further than she had before, the canyon began to change. It widened slightly, then split into 2 smaller passages. She chose the one that seemed to have more green, hoping it would lead to the water. This new canyon was darker. The walls were higher and leaned in closer at the top, blocking out more of the sky. The air was cooler, almost cold. The playful, whispering silence of the first canyon was gone. Here the silence felt thick and heavy, like a blanket smothering her. She walked for what felt like an hour, but the canyon just seemed to go on and on with no sign of a pool. Her city brain, the one that was used to clear goals and instant results, started to get impatient. "Are you lost? This is a waste of time. You should turn back." She pushed the thought away and kept walking. The further she went, the quieter it became. There were no birds here, no rustling lizards. It was a dead silence. The only sound was the soft crush of her boots and the relentless, high-pitched ring in her head, which seemed to be getting louder in the absence of all other noise. She finally stopped in a wide, circular part of the canyon completely enclosed by towering walls. This had to be it, but there was no pool. Just dry, cracked mud and a few brittle dead reeds. The spring was dry. A wave of disappointment, sharp and childish, washed over her. She had failed. Again. She sat down heavily on a rock, pulling out her water bottle. She took a long drink, but her throat still felt tight. The silence in this enclosed space was absolute. It pressed in on her from all sides. She tried to take a deep breath, but it caught in her chest, and then, without the distraction of walking, without a goal to focus on, her mind turned inward. It was like a dam breaking. All the thoughts she had been holding back came flooding in, not as quiet whispers, but as shouting voices. You failed with the Riverstone Gallery. Everyone saw it. They all laughed at you. Mark was right. You're not present. You're a ghost even to yourself. You can't even be here in the middle of nowhere without failing at it. What are you even doing here? You have a company to run. Ben is probably overwhelmed. Your clients are leaving. You're throwing your career away to sit in the dirt." The voices were so loud, so clear. It was as if people were standing in the canyon around her, yelling at her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The ringing in her ears swelled, feeding on her panic until it was a siren blaring inside her skull. The quiet, which had felt so peaceful just days ago, now felt like a vacuum sucking all the air out of her lungs. The towering canyon walls, which had felt majestic, now felt like the walls of a prison, closing in on her. She was trapped in this beautiful, terrible silence with the monster of her own thoughts. This was worse than the city. In the city, when the anxiety came, she could distract herself. She could turn on the TV, call a friend, get lost in work. There was always noise to cover the noise inside. But here there was nowhere to hide. There was no escape from herself. She scrambled to her feet, her backpack falling to the ground, spilling her water bottle. She didn't care. She had to get out. She had to get back to the open space, back to the cabin, back to a place where she could breathe. She started walking back, but her panic made her clumsy. She tripped over a rock, scraping her palm. The pain was sharp and real, but it didn't stop the storm in her head. She started almost running, her breath now coming in ragged sobs. The canyon walls seemed to twist and turn in confusing ways. Was this the right path? Had she taken a wrong turn? For a terrifying few minutes, she felt truly lost. The panic reached a fever pitch. This was it. This was how it would end. She would be found as a crazy woman, lost in a canyon, defeated by the quiet. She leaned against the cool rock, pressing her forehead against it, trying to calm her racing heart. "Stop," she whispered to herself, her voice a broken sound in the immense quiet. "Just stop." She forced herself to take one deep breath. Then another. She looked up, trying to find the sun to orient herself. She saw a familiar-shaped rock formation she had noticed on the way in. Relief, weak and shaky, washed over her. She wasn't lost. She was just panicked. She didn't run anymore. She walked, one foot in front of the other, her body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline. She focused only on the path ahead, not on the thoughts, not on the silence, not on the ringing. Just the next step. And the next? When she finally stumbled out of the canyon mouth and into the blinding afternoon sun, she collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving. She was safe. She was in the open, but she knew the truth. The real danger wasn't the canyon. It wasn't the silence. The danger had been inside her all along, and she had just run straight into its arms. The desert hadn't caused the panic. It had just held up a mirror, forcing her to see it. She lay there in the red dust, exhausted and defeated. The peaceful moment in the canyon felt like a cruel trick. She hadn't found an answer. She had only found a deeper, more terrifying question. If she couldn't find peace in the quietest place on Earth, where could she possibly find it? For 2 days, Ilara didn't leave the cabin. The panic in the canyon had left a deep bruise on her spirit. She felt raw and foolish. She had tried to run from her problems, and they had simply followed her, growing louder in the silence. She spent her time staring out the window, the beautiful desert view now feeling like a taunt. The ringing in her ears was back at full volume, a constant reminder of her failure. On the morning of the 3rd day, a practical need finally forced her out. She was out of coffee. The thought of facing Leo, the quiet geologist, made her stomach clench. He would take one look at her tired eyes and know she had failed. He would see that his advice about listening to the rhythm of time was useless to someone like her. But the need for coffee was stronger than her pride. The bell on the general store door jingled, sounding horribly loud and cheerful. Leo was in his usual spot behind the counter, sorting a box of nails. He looked up as she entered. "Morning," he said, his voice the same low, steady rumble. "Hi," Ilara mumbled, not making eye contact. She hurried to the aisle and grabbed a bag of coffee, along with a few more cans of soup. She just wanted to pay and escape. She placed her items on the counter. Leo picked up the bag of coffee. "Dark roast." "Good choice," he said, his tone neutral. He began ringing her up on the old cash register. The ching-ching of the keys was the only sound. Ilara stood there, feeling the silence stretch out, feeling the weight of her own disappointment. She couldn't hold it in anymore. The words tumbled out quiet and defeated. "I went back to the canyon," she said, staring at a display of local honey. "Like you said, deeper this time." Leo didn't say anything, but she felt his attention shift fully to her. He stopped ringing and just listened. And I panicked. Her voice cracked. It was so quiet. And all I could hear was, everything wrong. Everything I've messed up. I had to run out. I felt like I was going crazy. She finally risked a glance at him, expecting to see pity or maybe judgment. But his face showed neither. He just looked thoughtful, his pale blue eyes calm. He finished ringing up her items and told her the total. She fumbled with her wallet, her hands shaking slightly. As she handed him the money, he didn't take it right away. "Come with me for a second," he said, and walked out from behind the counter. Confused, Ilara followed him to the front of the store. He stood in the open doorway, pointing out towards the canyon walls that rose in the distance, painted in stripes of red and white. "You see those layers?" he asked. Ilara nodded, a little impatient. He had said this before. "Most folks see a big rock," he continued, "but I see a story, a battle. That dark red layer at the bottom, that's shale. It's soft, weak, it's made of old mud and clay. It crumbles easily." He moved his finger up. "That white stripe above it? That's sandstone. It's tougher, made of sand, pressed together over millions of years. It holds its shape." He dropped his hand and turned to look at her. "Now the wind and the water, they don't care. They don't stop and think, 'Oh, this shale is weak, I'll be nice to it.' Or 'This sandstone is strong, I should fight it harder.' No, they just flow. They just keep going, slowly, patiently." He looked back at the canyon. The water finds a tiny crack in the tough sandstone. It seeps in, freezes, expands. A tiny piece breaks off. It washes down and hits the soft shale. And because the shale is weak, it wears away fast. A big chunk falls, and over thousands of years, a whole canyon is carved. He turned his calm gaze back to Ilara. "You can't fight the erosion, Ilara. The wind and water, they're like the thoughts in your head, the hard times. You can't just wish them away. They're going to keep coming." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The question isn't how to stop the erosion. The question is, what are you made of? Are you the shale, soft so you let every little worry wear you down into nothing? Or are you the sandstone, tough so you let the water flow over you? You lose a few small grains now and then, but you stand your ground. The water carves both, but it carves them differently." Ilara stood completely still, his words washing over her. It was the simplest, most powerful thing anyone had ever said to her. She had been fighting her thoughts, trying to build a dam against them. And when they broke through, as they always would, she felt like a failure. She was trying to be unerodable, which was impossible. But Leo wasn't telling her to be stronger. He was telling her to be different, to understand her own nature. "I feel like the shale," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I'm just crumbling." Leo gave a small, kind shrug. "Maybe right now you are, but that's not all you are. We're all made of different layers. Some parts of us are soft. Some are strong. The trick is to let the water flow. Don't fight the thoughts. Let them come. Acknowledge them. There's the fear again. There's the shame. And then let them flow past. They'll still carve you, sure, but they'll carve you into something stronger. Something more interesting. Like that canyon." He walked back behind the counter, leaving her standing by the door. Ilara looked out at the canyon again. She didn't just see a rock formation anymore. She saw a history of pressure, of struggle, of slow, patient change. She saw beauty that was born from erosion, not in spite of it. She walked slowly back to the counter, picked up her bag of groceries, and looked at Leo. "Thank you," she said. And this time, the words were filled with genuine gratitude. He simply nodded. "Take your time." Driving back to the cabin, Ilara didn't feel the same urge to flee. The panic was still a memory, but it felt smaller now, less powerful. She had a new lens through which to see her own pain. She wasn't broken. She was being carved. The noise in her head wasn't a monster to be defeated. It was just water, and she didn't have to be a dam anymore. She could learn to be the canyon. The next morning, Ilara woke up with a new feeling. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was more like a quiet decision. Leo's words had settled inside her, changing the shape of her fear. She wasn't going to conquer the canyon today. She wasn't even going to try and find peace. She was just going to go and sit. She made her coffee and drank it on the porch, watching the sun climb over the mesa. Instead of the usual tightness in her chest, there was a low hum of curiosity. What would happen if she just let the thoughts come, like Leo said? If she stopped fighting them? She walked back to the narrow canyon, the one that had first given her a moment of quiet. This time her footsteps weren't timid or angry. They were just footsteps. She went to her now familiar flat boulder and sat down, placing her hands on her knees. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Almost immediately, the thoughts rushed in, loud and demanding, like a crowd at a door that had been locked and was now open. You should be checking your email. What if Ben needs you? That design for the library is probably all wrong. You're losing your touch, Mark was right. You're selfish for being here. Before, she would have tensed up. She would have argued with the thoughts inside her head. No, I'm not selfish. No, I haven't lost my touch. This internal war is what exhausted her and made the ringing in her ears scream. But today, she remembered the shale and the sandstone. She remembered the water, so she didn't fight. She just observed. She pictured the thought about work as a leaf floating down a slow-moving stream. She saw it, acknowledged it. There's the work worry, and then let it float on by. She didn't grab onto it. She didn't try to sink it. She just let it go. Another thought came about the failed gallery. This one was heavier, like a dark cloud. It brought a physical ache with it. She felt it, the sadness and the shame. She didn't push it away. She let the feeling be there, a heavy weight in her chest. She imagined it wasn't a monster attacking her, but just a piece of dark shale, a soft part of her that was being worn away by the water of experience. It was painful, but it was just a layer. It wasn't all of her. She did this over and over. A thought about her future would appear. She would label it worry and let it pass. A memory of a happy time with Mark would surface, bringing a sharp pain of loss. She would label it sadness and let the feeling wash through her like a wave, knowing it would recede. It was incredibly hard work. Her mind, used to churning constantly, wanted to latch onto every single thought and make it a big deal. It was like trying to tame a wild animal, but she kept gently guiding her attention back to her breath, back to the feeling of the cool rock beneath her, back to the faint sound of the wind high above. And a strange thing began to happen. The thoughts didn't stop coming, but they lost their power. They became like background noise, like cars passing on a distant highway. They were there, but they weren't screaming at her anymore. In the space that this created, the ringing in her ears began to change. It was still there, that high-pitched tone, but as she stopped fighting it, as she stopped pouring all her energy into hating it, it too began to soften. It didn't disappear, but it faded into the background, blending with the other subtle sounds of the canyon, the sigh of the wind, the scuttle of a tiny insect. She wasn't trying to empty her mind. She was simply learning to sit in the middle of the storm without being blown away. She opened her eyes. The canyon walls looked the same, but she saw them differently. She saw the grooves and curves not as random damage, but as the beautiful, unique results of a long, slow process. Each scar on the rock told a story of survival. She sat there for a long time, just practicing, letting a thought come, naming it, and letting it go. It was a ritual of stillness. It wasn't magical. It was difficult and repetitive, but for the first time it felt possible. When she finally stood up to leave, her body was stiff, but her mind felt lighter, cleaner. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. She still felt the echoes of her worries. The ringing was still a faint presence. But the key difference was this: she wasn't afraid of them anymore. She walked out of the canyon feeling not like a failure who had run away, but like a student who had just finished a difficult but important lesson. She hadn't found a way to silence the noise forever. She had found something better, a way to live with it, a way to let it flow through her without drowning her. The ritual wasn't over. She knew she would have to do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. The water never stops flowing, but now she was starting to believe that she could be strong enough, patient enough to be carved into something beautiful too. The stillness wasn't about the absence of sound. It was about the presence of acceptance. And in that acceptance, she had found a tiny, precious piece of freedom. The days began to find a new rhythm. Alara's ritual of sitting in the canyon became as regular as her morning coffee. Some days were easy, the thoughts flowing past like a gentle stream. Other days were a struggle, the worries feeling like a raging river she had to carefully navigate. But she kept showing up. She kept sitting on the rock. One afternoon, she felt a new kind of restlessness. The canyon, her beautiful, protective classroom, started to feel a little small, a little too safe. The thought came to her as she was watching the sun begin its descent. painting the western rim in gold. What happens out here when it's truly dark? She had been so focused on the ground, on the walls, on the internal landscape of her own mind, she had barely looked up. That night, after a simple dinner, she took the worn blanket from the cabin sofa and walked a short way from the porch. The air was cold, sharp in her lungs. She spread the blanket on the hard, dry earth and lay down on her back. At first, it was just dark, a deep, velvety blackness that was different from the diluted darkness of the city. She could make out the jagged silhouette of the mesas against a slightly less black sky. Then her eyes began to adjust. It started with one pinprick of light, then another. And then, as if a curtain was being slowly drawn back, the entire sky unveiled itself. It wasn't a black sheet with white dots. It was a deep, endless ocean of indigo and violet, swirling with countless stars. There were bright ones, faint ones, clusters that looked like spilled sugar, and a faint, hazy band of light she realized was the edge of the Milky Way galaxy itself. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen pictures, of course, but this was not a picture. This was real. It was immense. It was alive. In the city, you were lucky to see a few dozen stars. Here there were thousands, no, millions. The sheer scale of it was something she could feel in her bones. It was overwhelming, but not in the way the panic had been. This was a peaceful kind of overwhelming. She lay there small and silent on her little blanket and just watched. And as she watched, something inside her shifted. All the thoughts that usually filled her mind, the failed project, the lost relationship, the anxiety about the future, they began to feel small, not unimportant but properly sized. Her problems, which had felt like massive world-ending monsters, were now just her problems. They were the things happening on this tiny, rocky world under this incomprehensibly vast sky. The ringing in her ears, which had been the center of her universe for so long, was now just a tiny, personal hum in the face of a silent, cosmic symphony. She wasn't thinking about letting go of her thoughts anymore. She didn't have to. They simply lost their grip on her. They couldn't survive in this scale. The universe was too big for them. She thought about Leo's Canyon, the layers of rock representing millions of years. And here above her was a timescale that made those canyon layers seem like the blink of an eye. The light from some of those stars had been traveling through space for thousands of years just to reach her eyes tonight. A feeling settled over her that was deeper than any peace she had felt before. It was a feeling of perspective. She was a tiny, temporary creature on a small planet, and all her struggles and joys were part of that. It wasn't a depressing thought. It was the most freeing thought she had ever had. Her life, her career, her pain, it all mattered, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. She was part of something vast and beautiful and ancient. She didn't need to carry the weight of the entire world on her shoulders, because the world, the real, immense world, was right here above her, and it had been doing just fine for billions of years. A single bright star shot across the blackness. A meteor. It was there and gone in a heartbeat, a beautiful, fleeting spark. She smiled, a real, gentle smile that softened her whole face. She didn't need to be a fixed, perfect, finished thing. She could be like that meteor, just a brief, bright part of a much bigger story. She didn't know how long she lay there, a silent member of an audience of one for the greatest show in the universe. When the cold finally seeped through the blanket and into her bones, she sat up. Her neck was stiff, but her spirit felt lighter than it ever had. She looked up one last time, committing the sparkling, infinite sky to memory. The ringing in her ears was still there, a faint, almost friendly sound now. It was just a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. It wasn't the boss of her anymore. She walked back to the cabin, a small figure under a giant sky, feeling for the first time that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The night sky hadn't given her answers, but it had given her a map, so vast that her problems simply couldn't find their way back onto it. She had found her place not by looking inward, but by looking up. Feeling braver after her night under the stars, Alara decided to explore a high mesa that Leo had pointed out from a distance. "Good view from up there," he'd said. "You can see the whole world." The climb was harder than her canyon walks. The path was steep and scattered with loose rock. She had to use her hands sometimes, feeling the rough stones scrape against her palms. It was a physical challenge, and she welcomed it. Her body, which had felt so weak and tired in the city, was now growing stronger, learning new movements. When she finally reached the flat top of the mesa, the view stole her breath. She could see for miles in every direction. The canyons looked like tiny wrinkles in the earth, and the distant mountains were soft, blue shapes on the horizon. The sky felt even bigger up here. She felt like an eagle. She walked across the flat tabletop, the dry grass brushing against her boots, and that's when she saw it. At first, it looked like a large gray rock, partly buried in the earth. But as she got closer, she saw its shape was wrong for a rock. It was too long, too straight. She knelt down and brushed the dust away with her hand. It was a log, a tree trunk. But it wasn't wood. It was stone. It was heavy, cool, and solid under her fingers. The texture was incredible. She could see the perfect, detailed pattern of the bark, every groove and ridge preserved. She could even see the rings inside, the story of its growth, now frozen forever in agate and quartz. It was a tree, but it had been completely transformed into rock, a petrified log. She sat back on her heels, just staring at it. This was a tree that had lived and died millions of years ago. It had fallen, probably in some ancient forest, and had been buried under mud and ash and water. Over unimaginable ages, minerals from the water had slowly, molecule by molecule, replaced the wood, until nothing was left but this perfect stone copy. It hadn't rotted away. It hadn't disappeared. It had become something else, something permanent, something beautiful in a completely different way. Her mind, now quieter and more open, began to make connections. This was her. This was her pain. The failure of the Riverstone Gallery, the heartbreak with Mark, the years of stress and the ringing in her ears. This was all the wood, the soft, organic parts of her life that had felt like they were rotting, falling apart. She had been trying so hard to fix the wood, to glue the broken pieces back together, to make the tree stand again. And she had failed because that's not how it works. You can't unrot wood. But what if, like this log, she could let it be transformed? What if the weight of her experiences, the pressure and the slow passage of time, could turn her pain into something solid, something that was still a part of her, that still told her story, but was no longer fragile, no longer able to cause the same kind of pain? The petrified log wasn't sad. It was a marvel. It was a testament to time and change. People would travel to see this, to marvel at its age and its beauty. Its strength came from the very process that had destroyed its original form. She thought about the canyon walls carved by erosion, and now this log, transformed by pressure. Both were shaped by forces they could not control. The canyon was a lesson in letting go. This log was a lesson in becoming. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth stone. It felt like a message, a gift left just for her. She didn't need to go back to being the person she was before the failure, before the burnout. That person was like the living tree, green and growing, but also vulnerable. That person was gone. She could become something new. She could let the hard lessons and the difficult feelings sink deep into her, not to poison her, but to make her stronger, to give her a different kind of strength, a strength that was patient and quiet and deeply rooted in her own history. She wasn't broken. She was petrifying. The thought didn't scare her. It filled her with a strange, solid hope. She stayed on the mesa for a long time, just sitting with the ancient log. When the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange, she knew it was time to go. She stood up and placed her hand on the log one last time, a silent thank you. The walk down the mesa was easier than the climb up. Her steps were sure. She felt heavier, in a good way, as if she was more connected to the earth. She had come to the desert to find silence. She had found so much more. She had found a new way to see her own story. The noise in her head hadn't won. It had simply become part of the geology of her soul, and she was starting to see the beauty in that too. A gentle rain began to fall, a soft whisper on the cabin's metal roof. Alara stood at the window, watching the desert drink the water. Each drop darkened the red earth and made the scent of creosote bushes rise into the air, a clean, spicy smell she had come to love. Before, a day like this would have felt like a prison, a ruined plan. Now it felt like an invitation. She pulled on her jacket and walked out onto the porch, sitting in an old wooden chair where she was dry, but could still feel the mist on her face. She closed her eyes and just listened. The gentle patter of the rain was the only sound. There was no wind, no birds, just the steady, quiet rhythm of water meeting earth. It was a different kind of silence, a soft, blanket-like quiet. And in this new quiet, she realized something had changed. She wasn't trying to be still anymore. She just was still. Her mind, which for so long had been a room full of screaming televisions, was now quiet. The thoughts were still there, but they were like quiet guests in a distant room. She could acknowledge them if she wanted to, but she didn't feel the need to engage. The panic was a memory. The frantic urge to do something had vanished. She wasn't fighting the ringing in her ears. She wasn't fighting anything. She was just resting. Not the restless, exhausted collapse she called sleep in the city. This was a true rest. A rest that went all the way down to her bones. She realized this was the guided rest the desert had been offering her all along. The canyon walls had guided her to sit down. The petrified log had guided her to understand transformation. The night sky had guided her to perspective. And now, the gentle rain was guiding her into a deep, peaceful stillness. She wasn't leading this journey anymore. The landscape was. She had finally learned how to follow. She thought about her life back in the city, and for the first time, it didn't send a jolt of anxiety through her. She saw it clearly, like a map spread out before her. The long hours, the constant pressure to be brilliant, the social events that felt like work, the relationship that crumbled under the weight of it all. She saw how she had built a life that was all sharp edges and noise, with no soft places, no room for quiet. And she saw that she didn't have to go back to that. The realization wasn't a loud, dramatic one. It was a quiet knowing, as simple and as certain as the rain falling around her. She didn't know what she would do instead. She didn't have a new 5-year plan. But that was okay. For the first time in her adult life, not having a plan felt peaceful, not terrifying. She imagined her mind as a canyon after the rain, clean, washed. The dust of her old worries had been settled. The air was clear. The path ahead was still unknown, but it felt walkable. The rain began to slow, then stopped. A sliver of sun broke through the clouds, making the wet desert sparkle. Every droplet on a blade of grass was a tiny diamond. The world felt new. Alara took a deep, slow breath. She felt the air fill her lungs, and she let it out just as slowly. The tightness in her chest, the one she had carried for years like a clenched fist, was gone. In its place was a soft, open space. She stood up and walked out into the damp earth. The ground was soft under her boots. She looked at the canyon, dark and wet and beautiful. She didn't feel the need to walk into it today. She didn't need to learn another lesson or find another answer. Just being near it was enough. This was the guided rest. It was the understanding that she was a part of this slow, beautiful, powerful rhythm of the earth. She didn't need to struggle against it. She could just rest within it. She could trust it to hold her. She knew the journey wasn't over. Life would still have its challenges. The ringing might get loud again on a bad day. But she knew, deep in her soul, that she had found a place inside herself that was like this desert, vast, quiet, and strong. A place she could always return to. The external search was ending. The internal rest had begun. And it was the most peaceful feeling in the world. The morning she left, the desert gave her a gift. A perfect, quiet sunrise. The sky was painted, in soft shades of pink and gold, and the air was so still it felt like the whole world was holding its breath with her. Alara packed her single bag into the rental car. The cabin was clean, the key was back under the painted rock. It was time. She drove slowly down the dusty track, the crunch of the tires a familiar, almost friendly sound now. She didn't feel the panic she had felt on that first day. She didn't feel a desperate sadness. She felt a quiet gratitude, like she was leaving the home of a dear friend after a long, healing visit. She stopped in the small town one last time. The bell on the general store door jingled. Leo was there, of course, stacking cans of beans on a shelf. He turned and saw her. He didn't ask if she was feeling better. He didn't ask what she had learned. He just gave her a slow, kind nod. Heading out? Yes, Alara said. It's time. He walked behind the counter and picked up a small, rough piece of the petrified wood, just like the one she had found on the mesa. He held it out to her, a souvenir, to remember the slow time. Alara took it. The stone was cool and heavy in her palm, its weight a comfort. It was a perfect piece of the desert to take with her. Thank you, Leo, for everything. Safe travels, Alara, he said. The canyon will be here. She knew what he meant. It wasn't just the rock and sand he was talking about. It was the peace, the quiet, the slow rhythm. It would always be here for her. The flight back was different from the one out. Then she had been a bundle of raw nerves staring blankly out the window. Now she watched the landscape change with a calm interest. She saw the canyons shrink, then the farms appear, and finally the gray grid of the city emerge. It didn't look like a cage anymore. It looked like a different kind of landscape, one made of concrete and glass instead of sandstone and sky. When the plane landed, the wave of sound hit her first. The announcements, the rumble of luggage carts, the 100 different conversations. It was loud. But for the first time, it was just sound. It wasn't an attack. She walked through the airport, the piece of petrified wood a solid weight in her pocket. She felt calm, centered. She took a taxi to her apartment. Walking in was strange. It was exactly as she had left it, sleek, modern, and very, very quiet. It felt both familiar and like a museum of her old life. She put her bag down and walked to the window. The city skyline stretched out before her, a canyon of a different sort, with its own rhythms and its own kind of beauty. She thought about the office, about Ben, about the unfinished library project. A part of her expected the old anxiety to come rushing back, but it didn't. She just felt a clear, quiet question. What do I want to build now? She didn't have the answer yet, and that was okay. That night, as she lay in her own bed, the city hummed outside her window, a low, constant sound she had never even noticed before. She closed her eyes and listened. The ringing in her ears was still there, a faint high note, but it was just a part of the city's night music now. It didn't control her. It didn't frighten her. She thought about the desert, about the immense quiet, and the feeling of the cool stone in her hand. She could almost feel it, as if the silence was a place inside her now, a room she could visit anytime she wanted. She had gone to the desert to escape her noise, but she hadn't found a magic cure. She had found something better. Herself. She had found a strength that was patient, like the canyon, a perspective that was vast like the night sky, and a peace that was solid like the petrified log. The journey to Mercury was over. She had arrived. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new way to live. She knew that life would still be messy and loud and complicated. But now she had a blueprint, not for a building, but for a life where she could navigate the noise because she carried a deep, unshakable quiet within her. She fell asleep, not with exhaustion, but with a gentle tiredness. And for the first time in a very long time, she slept deeply and she dreamed of wide open skies and quiet red canyons. She was home,